Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. As you can see, Sakurada Reset won this month's poll. This is one of those shows that stuck with me in the back of my mind ever since I first read the summary for it, so I was excited to finally check it out. The matter of spoilers is a little complicated with this series, but I'll explain that when we get to it. Rather than saying it's about one or even a group of main characters, this series is the story of the town of Sakurada, a mysterious place where roughly half the inhabitants have awakened some form of supernatural ability. Perhaps even more mysterious is that whenever someone leaves the town, they lose their memory of their power. In fact, they forget that a town where magic is real and commonplace exists in this world at all. Our story begins with a boy named Kei Asai, who has perfect recall of everything he's ever experienced. A superpowered memory may not seem like the most exciting ability, but on this particular day, a classmate of his, the secretive and manipulative Sumire Soma, introduces him to Misora Haruki, a girl who can reset time up to 3 days. There are a couple limitations to her ability. She can only reset once every 24 hours. The reset relies on a saving mechanism. It's basically like turning a game off when you've forgotten to save your progress. The reset puts the world back to whenever she last saved, as long as she saved within the last 3 days. But most importantly, she's not immune to her own ability. She loses her memories just like everyone else. Like everyone else except Kei, that is. It'll take them a while to discover Sumire's greater motivation in bringing them together, but the advantages to this friendship are immediately obvious. Kei is characterized as a fairly ordinary boy who has a really strong sense of justice. He wants the power to improve people's lives and has never been shy about expressing that ambition. He's been studying the various powers here ever since he moved to this town. Misora comes across as emotionless, but she's actually incredibly empathetic. It caused her a lot of grief as a child, and she ultimately repressed her own emotions as best she could because she felt everyone else's pain so deeply. At the start of the story, that's turned her into someone who automatically resets time anytime she comes across someone crying, which never actually accomplishes anything, of course, because without memories of what she was trying to change, the second timeline plays out exactly the same as the first. That's a given, that without Kei's interference, a reset is meaningless, until the end of episode 2. The first 2 episodes are a prologue, these two becoming friends in middle school and deciding to trust each other and work together. In the background of all this is Sumire, and there's something melancholy about her from the start. She's the one who brought them together, and the romance that builds up between Misora and Kei throughout the whole series is pretty obviously going to be a thing from the very first episode. It's equally obvious that Sumire also has feelings for Kei from the start, and knew he'd be attracted to someone like Misora, who he views as having completely pure motivations for helping people. She represents his ideal of justice, so the fact that Sumire knew all this and still pushed them together gave her a noble sort of feel. I'll admit, I was a little lukewarm towards the other two at the start. This show in general, for such an interesting premise, I'll be the first to admit that it doesn't get off to a great start. The first episode is pretty dull. Until you get to the very end, this show does have a knack for cliffhangers. In particular, there's a lot of talking. Too much preaching about these characters' beliefs and strengths. Not enough showing who these characters are, letting me come to my own conclusions about them. So Sumire, with all her mystery and seemingly noble, self-sacrificial tendencies, was definitely an early favorite. And I swear, not 5 minutes after I started to think that. Sumire comes to visit Kei one stormy day, saying she's on her way to go hiking in the mountains, even in this weather. And they talk a bit, nothing super heavy. Mostly, she just encourages him to become the good person he wants others to be. Because Misora is already changing in response to their friendship and she'll follow his lead, and then she goes on her way. The next day, he meets with Misora alone, and they basically confess that they already have crushes on each other. But for Kei, it's a test, and he determines from her reaction that she's not ready yet for that kind of step. She is still just getting used to feeling her own emotions again, so he asks her to reset. Notably the first time he requests it for a purely selfish reason. But then, the second time around, though he changes nothing, Sumire doesn't come to see him that first day. He learns later on the news that she just went on her hike instead, and is found dead from falling and drowning in the river. He is understandably haunted by this. It's really the event that kicks off the rest of the series. Misora is also haunted, though really more by his reaction to it. It really instills this fear in her that her power could hurt him if she's not careful with it. So she decides she'll never reset again, going forward, unless he requests it. Clearly, there's a flaw in this logic. This tragedy did come about this time on his command also. It might have held a little more weight if she'd chosen to reset because she was upset at his reaction to her confession. But, you know, this hadn't been the plan, but I guess we're going to take a deeper look at the characters already. Misora thinks Kei is infallible, but I felt this was meant to be understood from the start as a character flaw, something she would have to overcome over time. Her whole story is about learning to trust herself again, acknowledging her more selfish desires. And it's a slow journey. There are a few times her personal growth is set back by a reset in favor of fixing whatever bigger problem they were facing at the time, but she gets there. I do wish her transformation over time was a little more dramatic, but she wasn't unlikable by any means. Kei was a little more complicated. One issue in particular I can only get into by discussing the later story, but in general, he was kind of one of those too perfect main characters, but done fairly well. He rarely makes any serious mistakes or loses his composure. No one really has anything but praise for him. On more than one occasion, he openly states that if he could be reborn as anything, he'd want to be God, and that's usually an immediate red flag for me. I had, traumatic Death Note flashbacks the first time he said it. But he genuinely wants to make this town the happiest place possible. He doesn't have any deeper agenda than just wanting to erase as much suffering from the world as he can. It wasn't the kind of god complex that came across as unbearably arrogant. All of these elements can make a character totally insufferable, but Kei never rubbed me the wrong way. If anything, he was honestly kind of bland. I get that creators want their main protagonists to be likable, but having flaws they need to come to terms with really do make for better characters. If anything is holding me back from telling you this series is amazing, it's that I'm a little apathetic towards the characters. They mostly get full character arcs, and I enjoyed the ending, seeing how far they'd come, but very rarely did this series make me feel. Which is a shame because it really shined in so many other regards. The way the writers approached the different abilities in this world was super creative. They'd introduce a character and give you a pretty simple overview of their power, and then keep deepening it, often taking them in directions I wouldn't have expected. Like, there's a character who can undo any lock with one hand and create an unbreakable lock with the other, and at first it's used the way you'd think, on doors. And then you learn that he can use that ability on people, too. A lock on a person will freeze them in time. There's a girl who can share her consciousness with all the cats in the area when she's asleep. Some of these things were pretty out there, and I loved seeing the various uses the writers found for them. It wasn't your standard, this person can fly, this one can turn invisible, set of magical abilities. I mentioned they liked cliffhangers. Sakurada Reset was really a series of twists and turns. There's a short time skip after episode 2. The story picks back up in Kei and Misora's first year of high school. Their teacher is not undercover, but he also works for the Bureau, a big division of the government in this town that oversees its inhabitants' abilities. Any ability-related issue goes straight to them. Mr. Tsushima oversees the service club here at the school and recruits Kei and Misora into it practically before the entrance ceremony is even over. This club is basically just a convenient excuse for Kei and Misora to intervene in issues around town on the Bureau's behalf, like government-sanctioned meddling. Originally, they were meant to just investigate on the Bureau's behalf, but Tsushima quickly sees how pure Kei's motives are, and pretty much gives them free rein after the first few assignments. But I don't want to give you the impression that Sakurada Reset is a vanilla, slice-of-life, daily adventures type anime with a little magic. It's got some elements of that, but there's an eye on a bigger conflict from the very beginning. Sumire's death isn't just a tragic motivator, but an important mystery that shapes the rest of the story. And so we've looped back around to the issue of spoilers in this review. I can tell you now that anything I say about the second half of the story is going to be kept very vague, but there's some important character growth that happens too that I just don't feel like I can leave out completely. Normally, I aim for a decisive cutoff point, but to be honest, there are some reveals that happen in the first third of the story that feel like pretty major spoilers. So if you're leaving me here, I just want to urge anyone who checks this one out to give it a fair shot, and maybe have a little patience. Like I said, I really wasn't impressed after the first couple of episodes, but once it takes off, it blooms into a really thought-provoking story. If you like a show that makes you think, I definitely suggest giving Sakurada Reset a try. If you want to hear more, I can't remember the last time I was this on the fence about spoiling things that happen before the story's even half over. In episode 6, we meet an old woman who's basically imprisoned at Bureau headquarters because her ability is too important to not be under their control. She can see the future. You find out she's one of the Bureau's founding members, and she's not exactly here against her will, but she knows she only has a week left to live. So she enlists Kei and Misora's help to break her out so she can spend the time she has left with the man she's loved since they were children. It's a sweet story, and it provides a little insight into the Bureau's history, but that's not why it's really important. Before they part ways, she tells Kei that the Bureau has been looking for her successor for a long time, and they did find someone with her same ability. A young girl who died 2 years ago, who Kei is very familiar with. The knowledge that Sumire could see the future changes everything. For one, it means there's no way her death was an accident, but right after that bomb is dropped, the old woman tells him that in the future she sees, he somehow reunites with her. If I wasn't impressed in the beginning, I was kind of blown away by episode 10, where they do succeed in basically bringing Sumire back to life. And it's revealed that every seemingly unconnected adventure they've had so far was orchestrated by Sumire, so they'd befriend the people with just the right abilities to help resurrect her later. I really like where all the characters end up at the finale. I want to reiterate that, because for most of the second half of the series, I was prepared to tell you that this show should have been half as long as it is. Sumire's resurrection all coming together does still feel like the strongest moment in the show. I like the character journeys of the later series, but the story in the second half was weak. It revolves around one of the Bureau's directors, the son of 2 of the founders actually, trying to turn Sakurada into an ordinary town. He wants to erase that magic memory boundary so everyone forgets about their abilities, and thus how to use them. The problem is, his arguments never really came together for me. He's not wrong that they're not necessary, but I never saw or heard anything from him that justified the hatred he had for abilities from such a young age. There was one really interesting discussion he had with his father as a child. His dad basically told him that he was so strong-willed himself that he couldn't understand or relate to weakness in others. It's turned him into someone who decides what's right for others and can't be persuaded otherwise, not even by the people he's making the decision for. Definitely not a relatable, sympathetic villain. But on the other side, this conflict did questionable things for Kei, too. It really brought out a selfish side in him. And I agree with him. The abilities bring with them so much potential for good if they're used properly. I don't think they should be totally eradicated just because there's the potential for harm, too. The closest he gets to really making a point is when he compares those abilities to things like cars, technological advancements that can do a lot of harm, but the improvements they've made for people's lives outweighs that. Natural advantages, like being born into a wealthy family, can be just as unfair to people who don't have them. Unfortunately, this line of thought is limited to a single scene. Most of the time, Kei's arguments just boiled down to that, personally, he likes abilities and wants them to stick around. It's worth mentioning that Kei is also the only one who stands to suffer from our villain's plan. Some abilities override others, but nothing we see overpowers Kei's perfect memory. If they can't stop the plan, he'll have to live in this world remembering what it used to be, and all the relationships he's lost because he only met those people because of their special abilities. And of course, Misora tops that list. I'm sympathetic to that. I think it could have been good for his character if he embraced that selfishness a bit. Like I said, Kei was pretty bland. This too perfect, pure justice persona the writers have got him cloaked in just isn't all that interesting. But if he maintains his godlike ambitions through that, a selfish streak raises some serious concerns. But the story ends before we really see him in a position of power, so at the end of the day, the real problem with this storyline is that both sides' arguments felt half-formed. This might have been solved by offering more perspectives. It's worth mentioning that, though they say that only about half the town has abilities, that's all we see. I think there was a single character who was important enough to be named who didn't have a special power. There was no talk of any unrest in the city over these abilities. If you're going to argue that these powers are unfair to ordinary people, your audience needs to hear their voices, their take on the issue. I think they could have had a much tighter, but still satisfying, tale if they'd ended it with reviving Sumire, and just left the audience to assume the end goal was to get her out of the city, with the Bureau none the wiser, so she wouldn't end up imprisoned like her predecessor. It's really a shame that the bigger arguments that shaped the second half of the story ended up feeling weak. Because the second stage did bring a lot of good things to this story. It's not just Kei and the director, there are a bunch of characters representing different ideals of justice. It was interesting to see them collide and interact, and mostly, by the end, figure out how to work together. More episodes gave them more opportunities to show off that creativity I loved, and I don't think they could have brought Kei and Misora to the conclusion they had in their personal story in a way that felt natural with only 12 or 13 episodes. So, there are definitely things that would have been sacrificed for that tighter story. Going into this anime, I was not prepared for a series that would make me think this much. It's a very dense story. There's a lot to analyze here. I mentioned I wasn't as emotionally attached, but I'm not ending this one feeling like my experience really suffered too much for that. This series still had plenty going for it. I would recommend checking out Sakurada Reset if you haven't seen it. Just know that it's definitely not a casual watch. There's just too much going on here if you're not prepared to get invested in it. Thank you for watching.